pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. It's a rainy Sunday night in Tokyo and I'm here with a glass of wine. It might take me two to get through this tag. It's not really a long tag particularly, but it took me more than a week, it feels like, to get it organized. I might get a little rambly. This is the Apple book tag, originated by Josh at the Literary Gladiators. Steve Donahue did it a few days ago and he tagged me, so double tag. I said it's a rainy night in Tokyo. It's actually supposed to be a typhoon coming, which is, it's never very scary in Japan, at least not in Tokyo. I once was walking down the street when a typhoon hit, and it went from drops of rain to an incredible deluge of rain within 25 seconds. And it was scary because I thought it was the wind, and I thought the wind was going to rip my clothes off. And I was soaking wet and really cold. But, you know, in certain parts of Japan, people do die in flooding or whatever. But in Tokyo, it's safe. But it's just annoying because if it doesn't, I'm hoping it hits overnight and moves through Tokyo before morning. Because if it hits in the morning, my 3 hours of classes will be canceled Monday morning, and that's about $120 that I will lose. So I'm hoping, although I wouldn't mind the time off, but I can't really afford to lose the paycheck. So those are some of the things operating in the background, weather-wise and otherwise, as I move through this tag. So the first question is Granny Smith, an overbearingly sweet work or character? So I noticed the other people who I've seen do this tag didn't really concentrate on the overbearingly part. Well, I'm not going to talk about anything that I particularly liked, because I have a fairly high sensitivity to sentimentality and anything that's too sweet. The quintessential novel from the 19th century is really all of Dickens, but especially the Old Curiosity Shop, which I studied as an undergrad. I love what Oscar Wilde said about it. I think I can quote it verbatim. He said, so it's about this little girl, and I think she's an orphan. I don't remember much about it, except the 25-page death scene at the end where she dies. Sorry if I spoiled the book for you. But Oscar Wilde said about that prolonged, sickly sweet death scene, one must have a heart of stone to be able to read the death scene of Little Nell without laughing. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about overly sweet books or characters. This is one that's being talked about by some people that I really like and respect, that probably liked this book, so please take my takedown with a grain of salt and with all due respect. But Your Heart is a Muscle the Size of a Fist by Sunil Yapa. I believe it's 2 or 3 years ago that it came out. It's about the clash between the police and the protesters at the WTO Congress in Seattle during the Clinton administration, so however long ago. Sunil Yapa, I kind of fell in love with him through the novel because he's just very open-hearted. He's a very good writer, and there were parts of this book that really touched me. But he did his damnedest to portray both sides of that conflict with some kind of equality or equanimity. And by the end, I was just wanted to puke at how he tried to tie everything up with a bow. And it kind of makes me cringe to think of it. So he tried too hard to make everybody get along by the end, and it didn't work for me. Another one that I bailed on within about 20 pages was Frederick Bachman's My Grandma Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry. I just couldn't stand the emotional tone of that book. It was just so, but lots of people like it, so everything is relative. Okay, number 2, Fuji, a work about a mountain. The one I have read that I'm pleased to rave about is A Whole Life by Robert Seataller. I've talked about another more recent of his novels. What the hell was it called? But it was where I talked about Calipigian. Anyway, I can't remember. I'll put her down below. But this is his most famous novel, at least in terms of his reception in English. And it's a short 150-page novel about a man's life from birth to death, living kind of maybe at the base of the mountain, but there's a lot of stuff going up and down from the very opening scene to the end. He lives at various elevations and works in the mountains, and so this mountain in Austria is quite key. And this is a beautiful, enigmatic novel that if you liked Stoner by John Williams, which wasn't set in a mountain, but also chronicled the life of a man from birth to death, I highly recommend this one. There's two on my TBR that also involve mountains that I'm looking forward to getting to. The most canonical is Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which is set in a TB sanatorium on the side of a mountain, and I hear it's just wonderful. And it's definitely a doorstopper. I don't know how many hundreds of pages it is, but I've been wanting to read that for 30 years. The other one I've heard about more recently, it's a Vietnam War novel, and it's set on kind of the side of a mountain, I believe in Vietnam, called Matterhorn by Karl Marlantes. I hear it's really good. Number 3, Red Delicious, a book that would be perfect if it was only judged by its cover. I have 2, and I'm going to show you the physical books, and then I'm going to put them down and put the digital graphic up because it's much easier to see that way. So this one I bought. This is one of the few books in my adult life that I bought solely because of the cover. This should be written in the present tense by Hele Hele. She's a Danish novelist, and I'll put it down and I'll put the graphic up now. And I saw this at the bookstore in Tokyo, and I just couldn't stop gazing at the cover, so I bought it. It's good. I think I gave it 4 stars. The writing or the translation is wonderful. It was my first exposure to Danish literature, and it's about a 20-year-old Danish college student, Dorte, who is kind of adrift. She's ostensibly studying literature at Copenhagen University, but she rarely goes to school, and she has some boyfriends and some sex. It's quite stunning. One of the things I didn't like about it was her aunt is a major character in the book, and her name is Dorte too, and that was really confusing. It didn't really hang together as a novel, but I was still quite captivated by it. What I still remember is, if I had just finished reading it 5 minutes ago, was a short page and a half scene between her boyfriend's parents, where they are interacting so fondly and they're kind of chasing each other around the backyard, and it just made my heart melt. It was so beautiful that I just thought, I don't think I've ever read such a beautiful scene about a middle-aged married couple expressing affection that way, and it was just delightful. So I remember the cover, and I remember that scene very vividly. The second one is a 2016 novel, I believe, Harmless Like You by Rowan Heseo Buchanan. Look at that cover. Isn't that gorgeous? I'll put it down now. I love this novel so much. I only gave it 4 stars. I guess I'll take 10 seconds to say my very subjective take on the Goodreads 5-star system. 5 stars means I loved it, including I loved it in spite of any flaws. 4 stars, I liked it, or I loved it, but there was some flaws I couldn't overlook. And then 3 stars, I didn't really like it. 2 stars, I didn't like it. 1 star, I hated it. So this was, I loved it, but there were some flaws I couldn't overlook. However, what I loved about it was the main character is Yuki. She's a Japanese girl living in New York City with her Japanese parents, who her dad's over in New York working, and this is in the late 60s, I believe. The parents go back to Japan, but she elects to stay and lives with some other people, and it's about her becoming an artist and growing up in New York without parents. And the writing is so beautiful, and I fell in love with Yuki, especially as the younger person, but throughout, she's one of my favorite characters in anything I've read in years. But the more contemporary part of the story is she left her husband and her young son and went to Berlin to become an artist and independent, and her estranged husband dies, and her son has to go and find her for the first time since she left him when he was a very small boy to work out the estate. And the adult character of the son and that part of the novel, which comprises maybe 30% of the novel. It just didn't come alive for me as much as the younger Yuki portion. So that was my only complaint. But I will read anything Rowan Hiseo Buchanan writes. And she's one of the nicest people on Twitter, which makes me really scared for her. Number 4, Golden Yellow, a book with yellow on the cover. The novel that I wanted to talk about, I can't find in my messy apartment. I think I might have lent it to someone, but and then I stumbled upon this, and this is something completely different. Expletive Deleted, a good look at bad language, and I do not know how to pronounce her name. Ruth Wajnerub. I'm sorry, I added this to the list so last minute that I didn't double check that. But this is a series of her essays. She's a applied linguist, researcher, and writer, and she died just a couple of years ago. But this is a very lively selection of essays that are academic, but not too academic for me, because I'm really sensitive to overly academic writing, but really fun and smart essays about swearing, and I loved it so much. Oh, I recommend it if you're just interested in that take on the language, because the grammar of swearing is interesting, and she talks about it throughout history and across cultures. She's got a chapter on Japanese swearing, and it's really, really good. I would like to reread it. Number 5, McIntosh, a writer that has influenced or would influence your writing. I'm not much of a writer. I had pretensions to write since I was about knee-high to a grasshopper. It hasn't really gone anywhere, but that's fine. I became that much more avid of a reader. I used to have every creative writing guidebook available on my shelf. I got rid of all of them, including this one, but this is the one that sticks in my memory that was the most useful for whatever writing I did do. It's by Rita Mae Brown, the lesbian American novelist, and she wrote one called Starting from Scratch, a different kind of writer's manual, and I loved it, and I'm going to track down another copy. And in a very few short pages, she taught me in that book about the two kinds of English. I believe that was the title of the chapter. The Latinate English and Anglo-Saxon English. And I had no conception of it until I read this chapter in that book, and I still haven't done much more research into it. I was able to pull up a couple pages of it on Google Books. I don't think I'm going to read from it, but just to give you a sense of, I'm sure this is really overly simplified, and there's probably a whole, thousands of more pages of research that I could do. But what I got from it is the Anglo-Saxon English are the words that you can feel in your gut, and the Latin words are the usually much more polysyllabic words that don't resound within. There's so much more that she talks about, but the lower classes retained the Anglo-Saxon English after the Romans took over, and the upper class adopted the Latin words. The powerful parts of English are still very much the Anglo-Saxon. Maybe that's debatable. For example, here are a few pairings of Old English or Anglo-Saxon paired with the Latin counterparts. Woman, female. Happiness, felicity. Friendship, amity. The verb dress or the verb clothe. Deep, profound, lonely, solitary. To me, I can hear and I can feel the difference, and it sensitized me to those two registers in what I read, and I, to this day, react very negatively and tend to bail on books that have too much Latinate prose. I could summon up a few examples, but I think this video is getting long enough. But there's a book that I recommend any writers, but also readers, because it's very accessible, and it gave me a lot to chew on. Next question, number 6. Honeycrisp, a book you have read that is in great demand. Now, the wording of this question has confused me or confounded me, and I've sat with it and listened to the other people talking about it. And I guess I've come up with 2 books that are currently popular, if that's the correct interpretation of the question. So one that I've read recently and the other one that I'm currently reading. This one I've already talked about and done a review on BookTube, and it's My Absolute Darling by Gabriel Talent, so I'm not going to say anything about it. Check out my review if you're interested, but it's a buzzy book at the moment, so that's one. 2, I'm also not going to talk very much about this one. A collection of short stories that's been nominated for the National Book Award, Her Body and Other Parties, which is the title of the year. Oh my god, I love the title so much, by Carmen Maria Machado. And I'm really enjoying it, except for one story that I bailed on, but otherwise loving it so far. I'm about halfway through, I think. So that's a short and snappy answer for a change. 7, Baldwin. A writer you feel needs recognition due to stunted acclaim, whether it was due to something that happened to them or a premature death. This writer has not received stunted acclaim on my channel, but in the wider literary world, she's not as read as she deserves to be. Longtime subscribers of my viewers of my channel might roll their eyes when I once again hold this book up, Mavis Gallant, The Collected Stories. So I'm going to read an excerpt, which I've never done. I think that's the best strategy with the books and the writers that I refer to numerous times, is just start sharing quotes. I love Mavis Gallant, and she has not received the acclaim she deserves because she was a Canadian living in Paris, writing in English, published almost exclusively in the New Yorker in America, writing almost exclusively about expatriates. For example, Canadians in Paris, Parisians in Italy, Brits in Germany, and so on, that nobody could quite claim her or place her. She's one of my very most favorite short story writers. Here is a paragraph. This is the opening paragraph from a story I just read a couple weeks ago in this 950-page collection of her stories called A State of Affairs. And it's about an elderly Polish emigre couple living in Paris. Their family name is Wróblewski, and the husband is referred to by his initial, M. So M. Wróblewski. And this is a quintessential Mavis Gallant paragraph. Owing to his advanced age and a lack of close relatives, M. Wróblewski receives little personal mail. Most of the friends of his youth in Warsaw are dead, and the survivors have not much to say, except about their grandchildren, and one cannot keep writing back and forth about total strangers. Even the grandparents know them only through colored snapshots, or as shrill, shy voices over the telephone. They barely say anything in Polish, and have English-sounding names. Their parents emigrated as soon as they could. M. Wróblewski's wife has a niece in Canberra, Teresa, wife of Stanley, mother of Fiona and Tim. He keeps their photographs filed in large brown envelopes. Should Teresa and her family ever decide to visit Paris, he will spread their cheerful faces all over the flat. I love that. Question number 8. Empire. A work about or set in New York. Most American novels are set in New York. That's been my experience. But the one that is freshest in my mind, and I'm not going to talk about it too much. This I talked about at length in my introductory video. So go back and have a look if you're interested. Sympathy by Olivia Sujic. And part of the story involves this really weird and enigmatic protagonist from the UK, a young woman, Alice, leaving the UK to go live with her grandmother in New York. And much of the novel is set in New York, and she goes for long walks in New York that are lusciously described, and it made New York come alive for me in literature the way no other novel has done for several years. So I had a few problems with it, but otherwise it was one of the most compelling books I've read this year. I'm also going to cross genres here and say, if you are so young that you didn't get a chance to see the documentary by Rick Burns, who is Ken Burns' younger brother, called New York, a Documentary Film, It's 17 and a half hours, and it was published is not the word. I'm so used to talking about books. It was shown on PBS from 1999 to 2003. I watched it via Netflix back in the day when Netflix was a mail subscription service, and it made me fall in love with New York so deeply. I see it's still available on Amazon.com and whatnot, so it's still available. It's a wonderful documentary. It made me fall so deeply in love with New York City that when I think I watched it not too long after it was finished. So maybe I read. See, I'm such a reader. Maybe I watched it in about 2004, 2005 when I was living in Vancouver, and I had this fantasy that I was going to move to New York City. And then I went for a holiday to Japan, and everything changed, and here I am in Japan. But New York has a special place in my imagination, and this documentary went a long way to making that so. Number 9, Gala, a work that fits under many genres. So I'm kind of the wrong person to ask about this, because I'm just going to bitch about books that tried to do that I was unhappy about. So am I conservative? Maybe when it comes to genre. So the first thing to say is there's genres like short stories and novels and novellas and essays and biography and stuff. So I'm fine with all that. But then there's the other idea within fiction, genres like science fiction and mysteries and fantasy and all that stuff. And I am very down on anything other than literary fiction, which I don't consider to be a genre because I'm such a snob that there's literature and then there's genre fiction, and I poo-poo the latter. Sorry. However, there have been a few books that I've read in the last couple of years that did try to bridge the divide between, for example, the first one I'll talk about is The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which is a much loved memoir that's also kind of theoretical, deconstructionist, cultural, theoretical text. I read it last year. Maggie Nelson is a woman who gets into a committed relationship with a transgendered male, and she gets pregnant. Her partner is transitioning, and she is transitioning to becoming a mother. Her writing about that experience is so beautiful and wrenching and probing, and I loved it deeply. But she, especially in the latter half, cuts and pastes in all this theoretical, I was going to say garbage, but that's my own bias, but all these quotes from the theoretical writers that she's studying at grad school or she's reading, and it's all this post-structuralist, deconstructionist that dilutes the power of what is a really incredible memoir. 95% of her readers disagree with me and say the whole thing is stunning, but I was not stunned by all that cut and paste stuff, and if it had been excised, it would have been one of the most powerful memoirs that I'd ever read. Another Unpopular Opinion. This was a nominee, and I can't remember if it ever made the short list, but it was on the long list last year for the Booker. David Solei's novel, All That Man Is. He's a Canadian writer living in London, I think. And this is a book of short stories about men, but somehow the Booker Committee decided that they agreed with David Solei's, I hope I've got this right, I don't know who decided it was a novel, but I think the author did, and then the Booker people bought it. And so it was on the list for the Booker, because the Booker doesn't accept short story collections. So it's a collection of stories about men at various stages of their life. Most of them are emigres, and that way there's a resonance with Mavis Gallant. But the characters change from story to story, but they said it was a novel. No, it's not a novel. It's not a novel. It was a wonderful collection of short fiction. A little bleak. Needed a better editor, but it was quite a stunning collection of short fiction, but it's not a novel. If the novel means anything, it doesn't include a bunch of short stories that have different characters. It just doesn't. So, I'm still on my second glass of wine, so my passion is not wine-fueled particularly. Don't get me started on I can't remember his name, but there was all that. Was it 1990s or early 2000s when the writer, what was his name, James Frey, I think, wrote the autobiography, but stuff then Oprah picked it for her book club, and then it turned out that half of it was fiction, and there was this dramatic episode where she confronted him, and that kind of thing drives me crazy. If it's not true, it's a novel. If it's true, it's memoir or autobiography. End of story. Number 10, Ambrosia, a long work that was easy to follow. So, easy answer. It's really a multi-part volume novel, but it's the Forsyte saga by John Galsworthy. I loved it. It was so easy to follow. It's from about the 1920s. 11, Jazz, a work written in or after 2010 that demonstrates freshness and originality. So, my go-to book, favorite book that I've ever read, best book I've ever read, Do Not Say We Have Nothing. I'm not going to natter on about it. Again, if I'm going to mention books this often, I'm just going to give you a new quote each time to give you a sense of whether the book is for you. So without any contextualizing, here is a paragraph that is so quintessentially Madeleinean. Time itself, the hours, minutes, and seconds, the things they counted and the way they counted them, had sped up in the new China. He wanted to express this change, to write a symphony that inhabited both the modern and the old, the not yet and the nearly gone. The ticking in the first measures was a quote from Prokofiev's Whirring Machines in Symphony No. 7. And in the foreground was a dance, allegro risoluto, quickening until the bars were rickety, with steps twisting free at last, like a gunshot to the sky. A free fall into the second movement, a scherzo, a trio of violins that did not sound like themselves, withdrawing as winds and brass began a slow march. A sound gone, just as it was learning to be heard. The only other thing I'll say about this novel is it's about China from about the Second World War to the present, and it's about classical music and classical music performers and composers. And classical music and China were two topics that I didn't think I was interested in reading a novel about, and this is the best novel I've ever read. So, number 12, Mutsu, a big book that you indulged. So the originator of this tag, Josh, I listened to him do this question at least twice, and indulge has two meanings. It depends whether it's transitive, has an object, or intransitive, doesn't have an object. Sorry to get all grammar teacher-y on you, but Josh used it as enjoyed. I indulged in the novel means I enjoyed. But I noticed the other people who've done it, they've done the transitive meaning of indulge. They put up with. They didn't really like something, but they indulged it. So I'm going to use Josh's spin on the verb indulge, the intransitive meaning, and say that one long novel that I read years and years and years ago, 25 years ago, was John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany, and it was wonderful. 13. What is your favorite apple? Maybe apple cider? I don't eat fruit. I think I eat an apple maybe once every 2 or 3 years. Banana maybe once a year. Other fruit, never. So, no, I'm not a fruit eater. And who do I tag? Number 14, Apple Tree. Here are some lovely booktubers who I have never tagged before. Beyond the Pages, Claire Reads Books, Ollie Bliss, and Run Right Reads. So that is my long tag. And now, look at that rain. Can you hear that rain? Do you think I'm going to be able to get to work in the morning? So this was fun. Thanks, Josh, for the tag, and Steve for the tag, and Thank you, everyone. God bless BookTube. Okay, time to stop the wine, don't you think?